Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the latest in deck technology. And for today's deck tech, I want to say first off, happy St. Patrick's Day for those of you who celebrate, but for those of you who don't celebrate, we have a fun deck for you that can get you kind of in the mood and spirit for today. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. So we are playing a deck called Black Clover, which basically takes advantage of some of the cards from Throne of Eldraine, and we're going to try to build up a ton of value with a bunch of adventure mechanics, and also we have a sub-theme of Night Tribal to close out the game as a plan B to the deck. We have 34 creatures in the deck, 5 non-creature spells, we have an average mana curve of about 1.9, and this is all in Jund colors. We are splashing technically into red and green, but this is primarily a heavily black deck. As you can see also, we have 5 artifacts, with 1 is technically an equipment and 21 lands in the mana base. Not gonna lie, the mana base is very expensive and primarily is the reason why this deck is so pricey to do, whether you play it on paper or in arena, but rest assured, if you want to make a budget version, I highly recommend just use tap lands and you could still get the most of it out of this deck. Real quick, not to deviate too much, but has anybody out there actually seen the anime/manga series Black Clover? It's highly underrated. I kind of thought that also was kind of cute to throw that in, because technically that show kind of has some awkward flavor and ties to the deck that we're going to talk about in just a second. But okay, enough of me being a weeb. Let's get back into the deck. So for those of you who are unaware, or maybe you didn't play during Throne of Eldraine, let's explain to you again what we're trying to do. We're going to take advantage of one of our main cards of the deck, Lucky Clover. This 2-mana artifact basically says, whenever you cast an adventure, instant, or sorcery spell, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. Now, as we kind of showed you earlier, we actually don't have any main instant or sorcery cards in the deck. However, they do technically exist. They're just in the form of the creature spells with adventure. So for those of you who didn't play through Throne of Eldraine, let's explain to you what, for example, this card does. As you can see, it's a creature and an instant spell, a 2-in-1. So that's how we're going to get max amount of value out of these cards. Adventure mechanics basically state that you may cast the card as an adventure. After you do, you exile the card, and then you may cast the creature later on from exile. So that's how you get the most amount of value, by doubling, sometimes even tripling up the triggers with Lucky Clover. But otherwise, let's explain to you how this deck is going to work. So we're going to start with a 1-drop slot with Forsworn Paladin, which is here just to either do some early damage, create some treasure tokens to help us ramp in the early game. We have sets of Felmire Knight, as you can see, it's a 1/1 Death Toucher, great in the early game for blocking and attacking, and also the adventure ability allows us to draw a card. Knight of the Even Legion also is a solid 1-drop. It is pricey if you do want to pump it up, but again, it sometimes can close out games on its own. Edgewall Innkeeper is mostly here just to help us draw cards, since we have a lot of creature spells that have adventure attached to them. In the 2-drop slot, you have Order of Midnight, which is its adventure ability, allows us to bring a card back from our graveyard to our hand, and it's a great flyer, although so. Smitten Swordmaster is kind of like our pseudo finisher in the deck. As you can kind of see, its ability allows us to gain life, and each opponent loses life whenever we have X amount of knights we control on the battlefield. So basically, if we can double or triple trigger this up with Lucky Clover, it can close out games very quickly on its own if we have the board flooded with knights. Rhymerock Knight is here to help us just pump one of our creatures, and if we can double or triple it up, it gets a huge buff to any one of our creatures if we can use that Boulder Rush adventure ability. Midnight Reaper is going to be here just to help us also draw some cards. Think of it as a more expensive version of Edgewall Innkeeper. It will hurt us with some damage, but we don't care because we have other ways of gaining life in the deck. Murderous Rider and Bone Crusher Giant are basically here as our creature removal. Bone Crusher Giant technically can burn out the opponent if we can double, triple the triggers up, but mostly you want to keep it just for its ability to remove creatures in the early game. Murderous Rider, same thing. You mostly just want to save this for bigger creatures, or you can use it to get rid of planeswalkers. If you can multiply the triggers on it with Lucky Clover, it's actually really powerful to use. And finally, we have Embercleave. This card will allow us to do a major amount of damage as also a sweet finisher, and also it costs less for each attacking creature we control. So if you can get out 2, 3, 4 creatures, this thing can be as cheap as only 2 red mana. That's insanely good value. But otherwise, that's the whole deck for you. Also, for the mana base, as I mentioned earlier, if you can't afford all these dual lands, just go with tap lands and it still will work just the same. If you do want to play this in best of 3, we have copies of Thoughtseize. You can also use Duresses also if you want to be cheap about it. If you want to, same thing. Soul Guide Lantern works perfectly fine, but Grafdigger's Cage is what ideally we'll have here. Any kind of artifact enchantment hate will be perfectly fine, but I highly recommend using the Cinder Vines here because it punishes those control decks out there. Knight of the Dust Shadow turns off our opponent's life gain. And Go Blank, along with Obnixilis, help us out and round out the package with Thoughtseize against, again, those control decks, because with Go Blank, you can then force your opponent to discard cards, and also it's great graveyard hate. You could argue that Obnixilis is also weird in the sense that technically it also counts as an adventure. It obviously doesn't have adventure, but its casualty ability also allows it to double itself up and create a ton of value in the deck. So I thought it was kind of on flavor for us to use. But otherwise, that's the whole deck for you guys. Again, the way you want to play this deck is play out your early cards, build up some value. You don't have to go super crazy until you get the Lucky Clover out. So be conservative with your 1-drops. Try to use them to pump up and force your opponent to use removal on them in the early game. Then this way you can put down your Lucky Clover, build up a ton of extra value with your other creatures that have adventure spells, and finish out your opponent with an Ember Cleave or Smitten Swordmaster's Curry Favor to then get that win. But otherwise, let me know in the comments below. Do you guys like just simple, quick little deck techs like this, where it's not really going to be anything super long? It just gets you right to the point, throws the deck out for you, and you can play with it. But my only other final thought is definitely for those of you out there who do want to celebrate the holiday, or you just feel like you want to be lucky with all of your bonus values you can get out of this deck, be sure to give it a try. And if you do want to come back to Throne of Eldraine for a nice little throwback for the holiday and remember how incredibly busted this set was when it first came out, be sure to give this deck a try, and I assure you, you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later!